Lastly, I want to say that today's sermon is meant to be a sequel to last week's sermon. However, if you weren't here last week, I want you to know we're going to bring you along and I'll catch you up to speed with some things. If you were here last week, there might be some review for you, but I want to pick up where we left off, which is the last thing I said in last week's sermon was that the entire experience of deconstruction is a gift from God. Now, that may seem hard to wrestle with, which is why we were exploring this idea more. I will reference this again at the very end of this sermon, which brings us to 1 Thessalonians. Now, to talk about 1 Thessalonians today, last week we talked about deconstruction. This week we are talking about reconstruction. And when we look about where we left off last week in the journey of faith, we talked about that word, which is deconstruction. However, if there is deconstruction, that implies that before deconstruction, there is construction or the building of beliefs. And then after deconstruction is that phrase, reconstruction. So I want to tell you a story that kind of goes through all three of these. And this story will span almost the entire sermon. So I hope it is an engaging story. And if it's not, just hold on. There will be a Q&A session about, and you can ask, why was this sermon so boring? It will be great. But we'll start with construction. Okay, the story has three main characters. The first is Jamie, who is the main character. The second is his friend Karen. We've all got to reclaim the name Karen. I like every Karen I've met. I don't know about you. And I feel like we have done a disservice to Karens everywhere as our society. So this is a good Karen in this story. And then there's Pastor Susan, who is the pastor of the church. Now, the story goes something like this. Once upon a time, there was a man named Jamie. Now, Jamie did not grow up going to church. He had always heard about church, but he'd always thought that those people were a little too holy for him or a little too self-righteous. So he kept church at an arm's distance. However, Jamie started working at a place, and he became friends with a coworker named Karen. And he and Karen started talking, and they became friends, and they talked about things that would matter to them. And eventually, Karen brought up the fact that she goes to a church. Jamie was intrigued because he didn't think that Karen was the kind of churchy person. So Jamie said, "What happens at your church?" And Karen began to explain it. And it was obvious that Karen really liked the church that she went to. So much so that at the end of her story, she said, "So Jamie, do you want to come to church with me?" And Jamie said, "Why not? Why not? Why don't I go to church?" So Jamie and Karen went to church one weekend, and when they arrived, they sat down, and Pastor Susan stood up to preach. Now, Pastor Susan was preaching from the book of 1 Thessalonians. And she said before the whole congregation, "Hello, everyone. We can rest assured in the promises of God as testified to us by Scripture." 1 Thessalonians 4:13 reads, "But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about those who have died, so that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope." And it was here that Pastor Susan said to the congregation, "Can I get an amen?" And the congregation said, "You got your cue, that's wonderful." So Pastor Susan said, "This is a beautiful promise. If you believe in Jesus, you don't have to grieve as much as if you did not believe in Jesus." Now this intrigued Jamie, because Jamie did not want to grieve. So he instantly started to lean in and thought to himself, well, if I could grieve less, this would be something worth belonging to. Pastor Susan continued to read from 1 Thessalonians. The next verse said, "For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have died. For this we declare to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will by no means precede those who have died. For the Lord himself, with a cry of command, with the archangel's call, and with the sound of God's trumpet, will descend from heaven, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up in the clouds together with him to meet the Lord in the air. So we will be with the Lord forever. Therefore," Paul concludes, "encourage one another with these words." Paul all of a sudden started to notice that there were tears in the edges of his eyes. These words meant something to him. They were victorious. They were hopeful. They were beautiful words. And he all of a sudden bowed his head in reverence and he thought to himself, that's what I want. I want the promise of 1 Thessalonians. 1 Thessalonians promises that I will not grieve if I believe in Jesus. And so he turns to Karen and he says, "I think I believe it." She's like, "What?" He said, "I think I believe it. Those were beautiful words, and I want that in my life." So the next week, Jamie came back to church. Karen was there. He listened to another sermon on 1 Thessalonians, and he loved it even more. The week after, he went to church even though Karen wasn't going, and the week after, he went again. He kept going, he got involved, he started serving on volunteer teams, until finally he went to Pastor Susan and said, Pastor Susan, I want to be baptized, and Jamie was baptized into the church. Now, over the next several years, Jamie continued to serve the church, continued to participate in faith. He was as good of Christians as you could imagine. He went and volunteered at local shelters. He also read daily devotionals. He prayed on a frequent basis, and he gave his heart completely to believing that all of this was true. In other words, he was told about the promises, and he trusted them. And then one day, he got some rather startling news. His friend Karen called him and told him something terrible had happened. And Jamie said, what is it, Karen? What happened? And Karen said, my mom was driving home, and on her way home, a driver swerved and hit her, and she passed away suddenly. Oh, Jamie thought, this is heartbreaking. His heart broke for his friend Karen. He said to her, I am so sorry for your loss. And she started to cry on the other end. And this was not one of those kind, polite cries. This was one of those ugly cries, right? After all, Karen had just lost her mother. And so Jamie was like, oh, I can barely stand this. This is so uncomfortable. I feel so bad for Karen. I wish there was something I could say to make her feel better. And so Jamie remembered that passage that first made him fall in love with the church and with Jesus and with the faith, and he said, Karen, I've got some verses for you I want to read. And so over the phone, he pulled out his Bible and he said, oh, remember the words of Paul, you do not have to grieve as much because you are a Christian. You will see your mother again one day. And he heard Karen start to quiet down. It's almost like she was pushing down the tears, trying to remember this promise. But from that moment forward, Karen didn't quite speak as openly as she did when the phone call first began. Now, Jamie thought for a minute, he's like, this is a strange conversation. I thought she'd be more relieved to hear these words. But he knew he had said the right thing because he had followed in the footsteps of Paul. And so Jamie started going to church. He still kept in touch with Karen. Karen would go to church for 1 more week, 2 more weeks, and then all of a sudden, Karen stopped going to church. And Jamie thought, that was odd. Why is it that Karen isn't coming to church anymore? Especially after her mother died. Wouldn't she be more interested in the faith because of this? And Jamie thought to himself, okay, something strange is going on. And in the middle of thinking all of that, all of a sudden, Jamie got another phone call from a different friend. And this friend said, hey, Jamie, remember our best friend from high school? He passed away suddenly from an illness that nobody knew about. Now, Jamie was really shaken up by this because this was Jamie's age. And so he thought to himself, this is absolutely wrong. But at the same time, he recited to himself 1 Thessalonians, and he said, this will pass too. Jesus will come back soon, and I will see my friend again. And so Jamie went to his friend's funeral, and he got there, he dressed up, and he started seeing the people around. And just as he was about to go into the church for this funeral of his friend that was his age, he stopped right before the door. And he all of a sudden felt the tears starting to come up in his eyes, and he began to weep. And it wasn't one of those polite weeps, it was one of those ugly cries. Jamie ran to the back of the church where no one else was around, and he collapsed on the floor, and he sobbed and wailed aloud, and he said to himself, what is happening? I shouldn't be this sad. This wasn't supposed to happen. I was promised that if I trusted God and gave my life to 1 Thessalonians, that I wouldn't have to grieve. And so he sat through the funeral. He was shocked when the preacher stood up, and the preacher didn't really have anything to say to him, didn't really fit with his ideas of what needed to be said. And all of a sudden, Jamie went from trusting this promise to saying, I don't know if this actually works. You see, Jamie had entered a process known as deconstruction, which means pulling oneself back from what one used to believe. And as he's going through deconstruction, he starts to question everything. He started to look at his Bible in the morning for his daily devotionals, and it started to sound hollow. He also would pray to God, and as he was praying, he would wonder in the back of his head, is God actually listening? He would go to church, and it would feel empty and lonely and inauthentic. So much so that Jamie scheduled a meeting with Pastor Susan and said, Pastor Susan, I am struggling. I don't really know if I believe anymore. Like, I was told that I wouldn't grieve if I went to funerals, if I believed in Jesus, and I went to a funeral and I grieved, and I am still grieving. And Pastor Susan heard this idea coming from Jamie, and she said to herself, or she said out loud, she said, Jamie, I know what you need to hear. And she went over to her bookshelf, pulled out a Bible, and read 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about those who have died, so that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. And she says, I know it's hard to see now, but I believe you can grieve less if you just give your heart to God again. In other words, Pastor Susan was looking at Jamie and saying, have you tried believing in God more? Now, Jamie heard this, and he was frustrated, but he was also polite. And he said, okay, I'll try that, Pastor. And he walked out frustrated with Pastor Susan. He went home and he said, that's it. If 1 Thessalonians is going to follow me all around, I'm going to know more about 1 Thessalonians than anyone else around me. Because if it's true, this is the thing that brought me to this church, I'm going to make sure that I know all about 1 Thessalonians. And so Jamie started to do some research, and he figured out the story that took place about 2,000 years ago. There was a city known as Thessalonica, and the city was kind of walking around, minding its own business like cities do, when all of a sudden a man named Paul showed up. And Paul showed up with a brand new message that no one in Thessalonica had ever heard before. He said, Jesus is coming back again soon. And the people of Thessalonica said, how soon? And Paul said, none of you will die before he returns. Now this sounded good to the people of Thessalonica, so they gave their heart to Christ in droves. And they believed it. And they told Paul, we believe. And this started to catch into a movement. And the church grew and grew, so much so that the religious people of the city, who were part of other religions, heard about the growth of the church, and they became angry. So angry that they formed a mob and rioted against Paul and his friends, specifically his friend Jason. And they drove Paul out of town to the town next door known as Berea. When Paul arrived there, he began to tell people that Jesus is coming back soon. They said, how soon? Before any of you will die, Paul said. And the people began to believe it again. And their church in Berea began to grow and grow and grow. And the mob showed up once again because they were upset that this was growing, and they chased Paul out of Berea. Paul eventually went to Athens and then over to Corinth, which is where the triangle is on the map. And he then settled down for his real first extended stay in the city of Corinth. While he was there, messengers came from the Thessalonica church with some bad news. They told Paul, hey, there's a funeral in the Thessalonica church. Someone has died from that church. And there's a massive amount of questioning that's going on because they are all staring around, sitting at each other saying, this was never supposed to happen. We weren't supposed to have to go to funerals. We weren't supposed to have to grieve these things. Jesus was supposed to come back before all of this happened. And so these messengers went to Paul and said, they got to have some encouragement. Can you write something to them? And so Paul sat down and wrote the letter to the Thessalonians, which would eventually become 1 Thessalonians. And when you read this letter in that context, this letter and these words mean something entirely different. We read, but we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about those who have died, so that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have died. For this we declare to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will by no means precede those who have died. For the Lord himself, with a cry of command, with the archangel's call, and with the sound of God's trumpet, will descend from heaven, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up in the clouds together with them to meet the Lord in the air, and so we will be with the Lord forever. Therefore, encourage one another with these words. Which raises the question, what are these words? And as Jamie was reading this, he thought to himself, encourage one another with lies? This idea that we can somehow avoid grief here in this life, because I haven't found that to be true. And Paul, just like Pastor Susan, had said, hey, have you tried believing in God more? Because that works for me. And these grieving people almost respond silently, it doesn't really work for us. And when you look at what 1 Thessalonians is really about, it's this idea that we were promised that the Thessalonians, that they would not feel the sting of death if they believed. So the Thessalonians believed, and then people died, they felt the sting of death, and the pastor told them that they should just believe more. And it's here that Jamie, upon realizing that this was the story of the book of 1 Thessalonians, he thought to himself, you know what? My life would be better if 1 Thessalonians never existed. I would have never fallen in love with Jesus at that church that day. I would have never had that promise shoved in my face when I was grieving. I wish it didn't even exist. 1 Thessalonians makes promises that the faith cannot keep, and it would be better if we didn't have it in the Bible at all. In other words, Jamie completely let go of the value of 1 Thessalonians. And once you completely let go is when you reach the ground floor of deconstruction. And it's here that Jamie began to look back at his interactions with Karen and Pastor Susan, and he became angry with Karen for inviting him to church. He became angry with Pastor Susan for saying all of these promises that couldn't come true, and he said to himself, you know what? I'm done. I'm not going to church anymore. I can't take it. And so without telling the pastor, without telling Karen, Jamie stopped going to church. And he didn't think much of it. And he thought to himself, my life is going to be better without this. I believed it. I'm disillusioned by it. It's now time for me to live a different life. So 1 week went by, 2 weeks went by, 3 weeks went by, and eventually 6 months went by, when all of a sudden, Jamie received word that there was yet another death in the church. Jamie was heartbroken. He had not seen this person in 6 months, but he was good friends with this person at church. And so he decided he would go back to his old church and go to this funeral out of respect for this person that he was friends with at the church. When Jamie arrived there was the funeral. He saw a lot of faces that he hadn't seen in a while. And yet he wasn't that sad, because he said to himself, I think my life is better without this. And as he was sitting in the pew, as he was waiting for this pastor to stand up, he realized that it once again was Pastor Susan who was preaching, and Pastor Susan began to speak at this funeral. And wouldn't you know it, she said, let's turn to the book of 1 Thessalonians. And it was here that Jamie thought to himself, no, not that archaic, backwards book. That is a worthless book. My life's better without it. What possible value could exist in a book where a pastor says, just believe it more? And so Pastor Susan begins to stand up. She says, let's turn to 1 Thessalonians. She goes to chapter 4, and she reads about Paul telling these people who are grieving that they need to believe more. And she says, this is the point of the letter. However, it is not the entire story of the Thessalonian church, she says. She looks out at these grieving people who are there at the funeral, and she says, I used to believe that it was better as a Christian to not grieve at all at funerals, to not shed any tears. But what can I tell you what I have found, my church? I have found that the Thessalonian story is our story. All of us are grieving together. All of us are weeping together. And there are religious authorities and figures and traditions that will tell you, don't grieve, don't weep, you're going to be fine. And all they are trying to do is they are trying to make themselves comfortable with our suffering. We are all grieving, and I want to tell you, as your pastor, Susan went on, that it's okay to grieve, and that you don't have to feel any shame for your tears while you're here at this funeral, grieving the loss of a loved one. Now, Jamie sat there and he thought to himself, is this the same Pastor Susan that I knew 6 months ago? And he couldn't believe it, because all of a sudden Thessalonians was starting to speak to him again. He said, no, don't fall for it. Do not fall for it. Thessalonians is a bad book. It's a waste of time. I'm not being drawn back into this thing. And so as the funeral concluded, Jamie went forward, he paid his respects, And there at the end of the line was Pastor Susan, who said, Jamie, it's good to see you. Could we go to coffee together? And Jamie thought I should probably say no, but out loud he said, sure, why not? They set up a time for coffee, and Pastor Susan and Jamie went to coffee, and they began to talk. As Jamie was talking to Pastor Susan, he said, you seem different. Things have changed with you, haven't they? And Pastor Susan said, of course they have. Wouldn't you believe this? Pastors change too. We also go through our own journeys, and we say things that matter to us one day, and then they shift and change months later as we become more aware of who God is. And Jamie said, I remember a sermon you gave on 1 Thessalonians, and Susan said, oh, that one. I know which one you're talking about. I want you to know I would never say that again. I've learned that that just represses grief and doesn't help people be human. She says, however, I have not given up on 1 Thessalonians. Instead, I have learned that whatever it is that bothers you about a particular passage is also an invitation to see that passage in a new light. So when I went back and I reread 1 Thessalonians, Pastor Susan said, when I went back and I reread it, I started to see that I was really upset with Paul for telling people to believe more. And so I realized that I identified not with Paul, but instead I identify with the Thessalonians. And she said, I get this idea. I realize that Christians everywhere, when they read Bible stories, we're always tempted to identify as the hero in every biblical story. That's who Christians are. We just say, oh yeah, I'm David, or I'm this king, or I'm that king. I'm the hero in all of this story. But she said, I found that when I identify with the characters who aren't the hero, the Bible becomes so much richer. Amen. And I realized that the story of the Thessalonians is my story. And those are my people. And they're just as much in this book as everything else. And so when you say life would be better if 1 Thessalonians never existed, I couldn't disagree more. Because Thessalonians is the story of my people and my journey through this faith. She then goes on to talk about a really strange person that Jamie had never heard of. This man's name was Ken Wilber. And Ken Wilber was a philosopher who lived, or continues to live, right to this day. And a little while ago, he was being interviewed, and he was being asked about what it is that life is all about. And he talked about how he started looking around at all of the cosmos and how the cosmos is just one of the most breathtaking, mind-bending things around. And he said, I've looked around and I see how evolution works and how stars come out of gas and how gas comes out of molecules. And it always seems like it's moving in a direction of greater complexity as things continue to move forward in the cosmos' history. He goes on to say, he says, the cell, think about the cell in a human body, the cell transcends or goes beyond its molecular components, but also includes them. Molecules transcend and include atoms, which transcend and include particles. The point is that since all holons are whole parts, the wholeness transcends, but the parts are included. In this transcendence, heaps are converted into wholes. In this inclusion, the parts are equally embraced and cherished, linked in a commonality and shared space that relieves each of the burden of being a fragment. To which Jamie responded and said, I don't understand what's happening. She said, let me read one more paragraph. And he said, okay. She read, and so yes, evolution is a process of transcendence and including transcend and include, and this begins to open onto the very heart of spirit and action, the very secret of the evolutionary impulse. To which Jamie said, I don't even know what that means. To which she would say, now, this is where Christianity starts to matter. Because it's here that we realize there's something very valuable. Because while Ken Wilber calls this the very secret of the evolutionary impulse, Paul had a different name for it later in life when he wrote the book of Ephesians. His words were the mystery hidden for ages in God who created all things. So what does this have to do with us, Susan said? What I love about the Bible is that it challenges us to transcend the ideas presented in it, but also include those stories in how we understand God today. And she goes on to say, if we didn't have 1 Thessalonians, then we wouldn't have the story of the Thessalonians, and their story is our story, which means I can see my story in the Bible when I include it. Amen. Now it's here, that Jamie would say, oh, Paul, he's the guy who said like, oh, you just gotta believe more. And Jamie would say to Pastor Susan, I can't take Paul. Like the fact that he says like, believe more, he just needs to get out of my life. And she would say, oh, no, child. It's far too easy for us to look down our nose at Paul and judge him harshly. But remember what you said to Karen so long ago when her mother passed away. You said, you just need to believe more. So while you also see the Thessalonians in your story, you realize that Paul's story is also my story because we have played that role too. And so reconstruction all of a sudden moves from deconstruction into this sense that we have to make peace with all that came before. And reconstruction is that God is so much bigger than 1 Thessalonians, and God is also in 1 Thessalonians. And God is there between all of these things, and the more that we can include those things, the better we will be. In other words, reconstruction is when we transcend everything that came before and also include everything that came before. And when we're able to look back and say, there were those days I believed those things, and rather than look back in anger, there's this sense that there is something beautiful before, and you're able to make peace with it, oh, that's when it means something. And so reconstruction is the inclusion of all that came before. And when we talk about deconstruction and we say that the entire experience of deconstruction is a gift from God, it is the ability to look back and say, oh, when I begin to let go of that thing, it was so helpful to me because I saw that God was so much bigger. And so when we look back and understand what reconstruction is, it's the ability to look back and realize that the entire human experience is a gift from God. May we be able to see that through construction or deconstruction or reconstruction, that all of it is a gift from God. Amen.